Hello, greetings. Welcome to the first episode of the season of Schwegman, Lundberg, and Woosner's Chemistry and Biology Seminar Series. I am Nicholas Lenzatella, your moderator for the series. Last year, we called this series the Life Sciences Seminar Series, but we broadened out the title this year to Chemistry and Biology Seminar Series to be more inclusive of chemical sciences that do not always relate to life sciences, such as chemical engineering, cosmetics, materials science, nanotechnology, and others, which many folks in our group practice. During this series, attorneys from the SLW law firm having a background in chemistry or biology will present on various topics at the intersection of the chemical or biological sciences and patent law. We will aim to give these presentations on the second Tuesday of each month. If you attend 3 or more of these presentations live and you have a mailing address in the United States, we will send you a free gift. Slides for today's presentation will be available in the chat, and a link will also be emailed to you. As a reminder, nothing in today's presentation should be regarded as legal advice. If you are seeking legal advice, please consult your legal counsel. I am pleased to introduce our speakers for today, who are guest speakers from Secerna LLP, located in York, United Kingdom, Charlotte Watkins and Hazel Robson. Charlotte Watkins is a chartered patent attorney in the UK, a European patent attorney, and a UPC representative. A founding partner at Secerna, she has practiced in the field of intellectual property since 2001, working primarily in the life sciences sector. She also has wide experience in patent enforcement and defense globally, as well as being highly experienced before the UK Intellectual Property Office and European Patent Office. Charlotte has a notable knowledge of the patent systems of many other key jurisdictions. Hazel Robson is a senior associate at Secerna, a chartered patent attorney in the UK and a European patent attorney. Hazel Robson is an accomplished intellectual property attorney with a deep understanding of the pharmaceutical and chemical landscapes. Her expertise spans a broad range of pharmaceutical IP, encompassing new chemical entities, polymorphs, formulations, manufacturing processes, and medical devices. With a strong foundation gained from supporting drug discovery, development, and clinical trials at a global pharmaceutical company, Hazel brings a wealth of industry knowledge and strategic acumen to her work. Today's presentation is about dosage regimens from a small molecule and alternatively a biological molecule perspective and identification of potentially divergent approaches from the EPO. If you have questions, please put these in the Q&A, and the speaker will answer these during the presentation. And the Q&A, if you look at the very bottom of your screen for the Zoom, you'll see a little box marked Q&A. That's where you should insert your questions for the presenters to answer. Go ahead, Charlotte and Hazel.
Thank you, Nicholas, for the introduction. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today to hear a few aspects of how to protect medical inventions and more specifically dosing regimens at the European Patent Office. Hazel, can we move next slide, please? So this is what we're going to go through today. We have a lot of content to get through. We may not get fully to the end, but hopefully we'll get a long way there. So we're going to give a background to the allowability of dosing regimens at the European Patent Office. We're going to touch on the various hurdles to patentability, including novelty, inventive step, added matter, and sufficiency. We're going to touch a little bit on how we perceive the EPO to protect large molecules and the dosing regimens, and whether or not there is a divergent approach, and some of the potential arguments that are being used in support of patentability. Then we're going to have a quick consideration of how potentially to draft with these hurdles in mind. And right at the end, we have a case study. So I'm going to hand over to Hazel, who's going to start off with discussing how dosing regimens became patentable at the EPO.
So, as many of you will know, method of treatment claims are not allowed in Europe, primarily so there is no risk to medical practitioners being caught by patent claims and being sued for infringement. And this comes from Article 53C EPC, which carves out method of treatment claims as a specific explicit exclusion. And here we have the article. I'm just going to do that, which states European patents shall not be granted in respect of methods of treatment of the human or animal body by surgery or therapy and diagnostic methods practiced on the human or animal body. And then we do have a little caveat that says this provision shall not apply to products, in particular substances or compositions for use in these methods. And this leads nicely to Article 54.4 and 54.5, which gives us protection of therapeutic products by creating a special class of novelty for this type of compound as a purpose-limited compound claim. I'm sure you'll all be familiar with this when you see European practitioners rewriting the method of treatment claims into this format when US applications enter the European regional phase, or quite often the Rule 161 communication stage. So as you can see, there's no specific reference to dosage regimes in these articles, and we actually needed a decision of the enlarged board before such claims became common practice at the EPO. And that decision was G2 of 08. So there'd been various diverging case law. The boards of appeal didn't quite know whether they should be granting these things or not. So a question was referred, which basically asked whether you could patent a claim where the dosage regime was the only feature that was providing novelty and inventive step. And the enlarged board looked at all the provisions of the EPC and they said, actually, Article 54.5 refers to any specific use. So yes, novelty and inventiveness can reside in the dosage regime and you don't need anything else. So that gave rise to the form of claims we have today. So a substance that we're talking about today, a substance for use in the treatment of disease Y, wherein the substance X is for administration at a dose of, and then you would specify the amount and the frequency of administration. But what value do these claims have? So if you have your API claims and your formulation claims and device claims, why do we need these dosage regime claims? Well, the simple answer is they just add to the patent thicket. It's another barrier to entry for generics to stop them from entering a particular therapeutic market. They can be filed as a divisional application from the API or formulation applications, assuming they contain suitable dose information and data. But more usually, they're filed as a standalone application intended to increase the effective life of a patent portfolio by providing additional years of patent protection beyond the substance per se. They're also valuable because if you can draft your claims in such a way that it reflects your label claim on your product, it's a lot easier to catch infringers. You can imagine could be quite easy for a potential infringer to work around a formulation claim with some minor tweaks. But if you have a claim granted that reflects the use described on the product label and a third party launches a product with the very same instructions on their label, then you've got a very strong case for infringement. This is just an example of a product where these claims have been very valuable. This is Xarelto, and there is structure for anybody who is keen on knowing these bits of information. So this is an anticoagulant, a blood thinner. The compound protection expired in December 2020 and an SPC extended that to April 24. But the dosage regime has actually a dosage regime patent to, I think it was once a day administration to I think it was a 10, 15 or 20 mg dose, has extended this again for an additional 2 years. And that translates to a lot of sales. I mean, in 2023, there was $4.7 billion worth of sales. The first quarter of this year, that had dropped off a bit, but that's mainly due to generics who are entering the market. It's had an interesting path, the dosage regime patent covering this. So it was granted by the EPO. It was then challenged through the opposition process and found to be invalid for lack of inventive step. But interestingly, the Board of Appeal overturned the opposition division and it was upheld. So there's now a lot of ongoing litigation in the national courts with mixed results. I think it's been upheld in the Netherlands, Sweden, Lithuania, Belgium, but then it's also been revoked and found invalid in Germany, Norway, France, the UK, and there's lots of other territories where it's still ongoing. But I think you can see how this type of patent claim has provided value to the patentee. The problem with dosage regime applications is that the prior art is usually your own. It often takes the form of boilerplate language in earlier applications, or it can appear in investor relation documents or academic publications reporting the success or the planning of trials and the success of clinical trials, or in some submissions to regulatory authorities, which aren't always confidential. But all this means is there is a big conflict between trying to keep such inventions confidential until you can get an application on file and the data that's needed from a clinical trial to put into the patent application to demonstrate that the invention actually works in terms of efficacy and safety. And it is a tightrope, even more so in Europe since 2024, where we have the EU introduced a new clinical trial information system, which was part of a drive for transparency and also, I think, to help with trial recruitment, where protocols and data generated from them are published in a timely and orderly manner. And we can't hold them back. We can't defer those publications for the sake of a patent application. Now, the EPO have to some extent recognised this problem, and there is a body of case law that has established that protocols without the data are not novelty destroying. And here is some of the case law. So in T2506/12, the board held that you actually needed a disclosure, a lack of novelty. For a lack of novelty attack to be successful, you actually need a disclosure that the API is effective and safe, and that if there's no data, then it's not novelty destroying. But that doesn't help with the thorny issue of inventive step, because there is other case law that is listed here that stated that published pre-trial protocols do count as prior art, and it even went further and said that actually the announcement of a trial itself suggests there is a reasonable expectation of success because of all the work that's gone into the preclinical work that's gone into getting to the point of having a trial. So, I mean, the key takeaway here is that if you're thinking about filing this type of application, it's about working very carefully with regulatory and clinical colleagues to try and identify if there is a window of opportunity for filing before such information becomes public knowledge. I'm just going to divert and focus a little bit on small molecules now, because there is a bit of a difference between how the EPO are treating small molecules and biologicals when it comes to patentability. And you'll see the difference when Charlotte starts to talk. You'll also see that I've unfortunately drawn the short straw on this one. Some of the difference, I think, stems from the fact that clinical practices for small molecules are very well established and a well-trodden path. But it does mean that the EPO starting position is that determining dosage regimes are routine experiments. And as I mentioned before, they've even gone so far as to say there is a reasonable expectation of success if you are having a trial because of the work that's gone into getting to that trial. And it just means it's really difficult. There's no sort of other way of saying it. Things we can do to help: consider putting in other features as well as the dosage regime. Are there little tweaks to formulation that have been made? Is there anything about the condition? Have you had to define patient groups? Or the mode of administration. The more features we can include, the tighter and better, and hopefully more inventive the EPO will view the claim as being. And as I said before, the best type of claim is a really narrow claim to a marketed product that reflects your label claim, which is going to be more defendable and enforceable. Now, I've mentioned T2963 and 19. I'm just going to, don't worry, I'm not going to read this. This is just for information. I think the key things to take away from this slide are just it was a claim, it was a triple combination dosage regime for irinotecan with 2 other drugs for patients who had failed with gemcitabine. And in that case, it was opposed. The opposition division held that it lacked inventive steps, so it was appealed. The key piece of prior art was the published protocol. No results, but the protocol was in the public domain. And throughout the proceedings, the objective technical problem had been formulated against this piece of prior art as the provision of an effective and safe regime for this particular subgroup of patients who'd failed with previous treatments. Now, the good thing that the board did say was that you couldn't always assume a reasonable expectation of success, and you had to look at it on a case-by-case basis. And in this case, because previous trials had shown that there were particular challenges associated with treating this particular patient group, that without the data, the skilled person couldn't expect that this treatment would be safe and effective. So on that basis, you might expect that the lack of inventive step would have been overturned. If only life was that simple, but because there was, as always, there were other prior art documents. One of those prior art documents did demonstrate the same combination of drugs. The key API was in a slightly different form, but the patentee had used some of these documents to support their own claims, to support that the claim was effective. So they sort of leaned into it for sufficiency. So they ended up in a bit of a inventive step sufficiency squeeze, and from which there was no escape. So ultimately, the claim did fail on inventive step. So this is just a fairly recent piece of Board of Appeal case law from May. It's just to illustrate how closely the EPO will look at the clinical trial data. So in this case, there was the inventive step, the inventive bit of the claim was the administration regime. So it was on day 1 and day 8 of a 28-day cycle with a minimum of 2 cycles. And that was the only difference between the existing prior art, which I think administered once every 3 weeks. Now, the alleged technical effect that the patentee had said that this 1 and 8 day administration would give you was a reduced incidence in thrombocytopenia, so sort of less bad side effects. And there were 2 schedules in the patent document that they pointed to that said it demonstrated that you did actually have this effect. But the Board of Appeal sort of went through this with the help of the opponents and spotted that actually the dosages that were used in each of these regimes were different. So concluded that you couldn't actually pin the advantage on the difference in the actual sort of day 1 and 8 versus once every 3 weeks. So they disregarded the problem that had been formulated and reformulated simply as an alternative dosage regime, and it failed on that basis. So Charlotte, I think it's over to you.
Yeah. So Hazel's touched on novelty and inventive step, and as many practitioners that handle cases in front of the European Patent Office, one of the more difficult aspects of prosecuting patents at the EPO is the question of added matter. The EPO sets an incredibly high bar for the allowability of amendments, and added matter is a ground that is usually raised in most opposition proceedings. So I'm going to touch on added matter and particularly its relevance to dosing regimen patents, because I believe that they have an even higher hurdle to overcome at times. So the legal basis for considering whether or not an amendment adds matter is Article 1232, which is set out there, and it states that the European patent application or European patent may not be amended in such a way that it contains subject matter which extends beyond the content of the application as filed. Can you move on, Hazel? This is further legal basis was provided by the enlarged Board of Appeal decision G2 of 10, and this sets the so-called gold standard for assessing amendments and their allowability. So the test set out in G2 of 10 is whether or not the skilled person would derive the subject matter as amended directly and unambiguously using common general knowledge from the content of the application as filed. So the disclosure can be explicit or implicit in the application. However, in practice, it seems that near verbatim support is usually required for amendments to be considered allowable. Move on, thank you. So I've kind of put a hypothetical claim here and some of the problems it may face during prosecution. So an originally filed claim may be to an antibody specific to a target SX for use in the treatment of a broadly defined disease, such as an inflammatory disorder, where an antibody is for administration in a dosage of A to B. During prosecution, the European examiner will often require you to limit such a claim, and that's usually in response to objections raised under Article 83, which is sufficiency, and Article 56, which is inventive step. So, for example, the definition of the product may often need to be limited, and that is often, if it's in the case of an antibody, it's to the specific antibody that has been shown to have a therapeutic effect. So in this instance, for example, we might say rituximab, and that is required to overcome 83 objections. Limitation to an antibody with specific CDRs often no longer overcomes such an objection, and so you need the whole antibody defined in the claim. In addition, the European examiner may raise Article 56 objections to the breadth of the medical use. So, for example, if the application as filed only contains data showing that one type of disorder is treated, you may well not be allowed a more broadly defined disease genus. So each of these amendments, you may have to narrow a polarity of features, and each amendment could raise the risk of contravening Article 1232. So if you could move on. So the claim might get to this stage where the amendments are shown in red. So you have rituximab for use in the treatment of rheumatoid arthritis, wherein rituximab is for administration in a dose of 1 gram followed by 1 gram after 2 weeks. For example, this is just a hypothetical claim. So each of those restrictions may be considered a selection from a list of features originally disclosed in the application as filed. For example, the application as filed may have a number of anti-CD20 antibodies. It may have a number of different disorders and a range of possible dosages. So these selections, when combined, may be considered to contravene Article 1232. You move on. So this example is a way of amending using multiple selections. And then the question will be whether or not the new claim contains subject matter which was not disclosed in an individualized manner in the application as filed. And a key question will be whether or not there are pointers to the selected subject matter and the particular combination in the claim as amended. Other amendments that may be considered to add matter, particularly in the context of dosing regimens, is amendments that are taken from an example. So many of the examples in these kind of dosing regimen patent applications will have potentially full clinical trial protocols. and so will include, as well as potential dose and disorder that is treated, may contain other features such as exclusion criteria, whether or not the patient is selected using biomarkers, and so on. And if a claim is amended to include some of the subject matter, for an example, but not all of it, it could be considered to be a so-called intermediate generalization. And the EPO treats these as contravening Article 123 and will raise an added matter objection. Another possibility is that during clinical trials, a dosing regimen may have moved on from what was envisaged by the application as filed, particularly what was presented in the examples. And the applicant is then left trying to cherry pick certain aspects of the disclosure of the application as filed to retrofit the new dosing that is being covered in real life clinical trials. So all of these may be considered to add matter, and there's various case law on that. If you could move on. Thanks, Hazel. So this is a Board of Appeal decision T363 of 18, which related to a claim which was in an old style medical use claim, which was use of anti-CD20, and the anti-CD20 antibody was rituximab for the treatment of chronic lymphocytic leukemia in a human patient, wherein the medicament is for administration in a particular dosing range, but there was no timing to that dosing range. In this instance, the patent was actually a divisional application, and therefore it was Article 76(1) that was being considered, which is equivalent to Article 1232. So we had to consider whether or not this claim found basis in the parent application. And example 3 was pointed to as supporting this claim. And the Board of Appeal accepted that the skilled person would derive a number of features of this claim from example 3. So example 3 did disclose the particular dosing range of 500 to 1500 mg per meter squared, and of rituximab. It also considered it to disclose the treatment of human CLL, and therefore that was also disclosed in example 3. You move on, Hazel. However, example 3 disclosed the treatment in the context of a specific stepped up regimen. So it had a number of different, had 4 administrations of rituximab in this particular dosage, whereas the claim in question had a sole dose of 500 to 1500 mg per meter squared of rituximab. As a result, the Board of Appeal said that example 3 could not be used as basis for the claim to just a single dose, because it only disclosed a disclosure for doses. So the patent was revoked due to added matter. Move on. Just to give some good news on added matter, because we don't get a lot of that often. T235 of 22, there was again a number of claims, a number of amendments to claim 1 to limit the scope of the claim, including a primer agent was specified, a particular anti-CD47 agent was specified, a particular dosing regimen was also inserted into the claim. The disease was limited to cancer, and it was for the treatment of primates. So that was also a limitation. However, in this instance, the Board of Appeal decided that each amendment was either a general definition or a preferred embodiment of the invention. And so the skilled person would therefore have derived the combination of these features in claim 1 as in the application as filed as being disclosed directly and unambiguously. As a result, the patent was upheld as having no added matter. as it happens, which I'll come to later, this patent was then referred back to the opposition division to decide on other matters, which I will refer to later. Over to you, Hazel.
Charlotte, quick question for you from the audience regarding added matter and support. If the original application includes a description of the clinical trial with all of its details, and that is followed by a recitation of a subset of the details, would the recitation of the subset in an amended claim be considered to be disclosed? Would that be supported?
Yes, I think in principle. So if there is a clinical trial which had a particular dosing and then there was further disclosure of, say, a timing issue, or there was a the concern would be if the clinical trial was looking at, say, 3 different timing issues and you selected one, the question would be, is there enough of a pointer in the application as filed to that selected timing? The European Patent Office is very keen to see that there are pointers to any amendment that you make that might be considered a selection. So if it wasn't a preferred timing, that amendment on its own might be okay. That amendment in combination with other possible amendments, you would then have to justify why it was considered a preferred embodiment. I hope that makes sense.
That does make sense. I have a related question, and this can be for you both. Myself, as well as many others, have struggled with the EPO's strict requirement for explicit support of amendments and prohibition from selection from multiple lists. And perhaps you'll be talking about this later, but are there specific drafting techniques that you recommend to decrease the risk that no basis will be found for amendments needed later during prosecution?
So we have considered this a little bit, and Hazel, feel free to jump in. But I think one option would be to, instead of having a cascade of potential features, is actually to have more independent statements of invention to specific combination of features. So it does take a bit of a crystal ball, but instead of, because if you have a broad independent claim, as my example showed, and then a number of cascading sub-features, the risk you run is that actually the EPO will consider that cascade to be a new matter. Whereas if you have one or more independent statements of invention which correspond to an independent claim that are narrower than your broad definition. So, for example, you immediately go down to rituximab plus what you believe will be your preferred dosage plus your preferred timing, and you can't always get it right, but to have that in an independent form right from the start, I think would help.
I think multiple claim dependencies are your friend at the EPO. Although I say that, but there are some fairly recent case law where the Board of Appeal actually said, if you have too many multiple claim dependencies, we're going to take it as a selection. And we have been talking about whether you sort of you number features and you put tables of features in, or you have a table that says, actually, I like the combination of claim 1, claim 3, and claim 5. And then you have another statement, I like 2, 4, and 6. It's just really difficult. And it comes back to Charlotte was saying, if there are particularly preferred features and we can say they're particularly preferred and why they're particularly preferred, it does help. But it is getting too ridiculous, I think, and they are becoming too strict. And we just hope at some point there'll be a sea change and we'll move back to something that's a bit more sensible.
How many multiple dependent claims is too many? Is there a bright line there at all?
That's an interesting question. I can't remember how many claims there were in the case I'm thinking of. There were quite a few. I mean, there's no hard and fast rule, and it would have to be a sort of on a case by case basis, I think. But definitely multiple dependencies help us, because if we are relying on everything being dependent from claim 1, the examiner will say, well, you've not given us any basis for combining claims 2, 3, and 4. You've only ever given us individual features in conjunction with claim 1, and that is a common objection. The examiners do that. I mean, I do have to say it also depends on the examiner. Some examiners are reasonable, some examiners are not.
Sure. I think the audience would enjoy if you have time before the end of the presentation, if you could share that case that considers too many multiply dependent claims as a selection versus, a more limited number as permittable. That would be interesting, I think, to the audience.
I will see if I can track it down while I'm talking.
Okay, thank you.
Should I move on to sufficiency? I've not actually got too much to say about sufficiency, other than the claimed efficacy. I mean, as it says in the slide, you have to demonstrate that the efficacy you're claiming, the effect that you're claiming to have, is credible at the date of filing. Preferably, this is because there's lots of lovely data in the patent application, but appreciate that isn't always the case, especially when trial protocols are being published before data can be generated. And you can lean into the common general knowledge under the prior art documents. But as we've seen with the previous case law I talked about, the 2963 of 19, that can sort of force you into this thin line you're walking between sufficiency and inventive step. Now, sufficiency it's not considered as often as inventive step. It does come hand in hand with inventive step, but I think there's definitely a tendency for European examiners and on the various divisions and boards of appeal to deal with inventive step first, or if it is a sufficiency issue, to try and deal with it under an inventive step heading. I think just because of the very formulaic way the EPO deals with inventive step, you pop your prior art and your distinguishing features in at the top, and theoretically it should all flow through nicely, and you should get a nice neat answer at the bottom. So sufficiency tends in these type of cases tends not to come up as often as inventive step, because if they can deal with it under inventive step, they will. That being said, I do have one piece of case law to mention, and it's more about patient groups, defining patient groups than anything else. And it was 4-aminopyridine for MS, where it was administered twice daily. I think it was a sustained release formulation. There was no dispute that the sustained release formulation was sufficient, but one of the challenges the patent faced in opposition was that the claim wasn't credible because they hadn't singled out the responding group from the non-responding group, and the claim just covered everybody. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on which side of the fence you're on, the Board of Appeal sort of dismissed this as a line of argument. Firstly, the application as filed had actually acknowledged that you have different patients who will respond and not respond. And they also confirmed that the existence of non-responders is pretty well established. It's not a reason to deny sufficiency. And here's a little bit from the decision. So they just said it's a common phenomenon, and the skilled person knows how to deal with it, basically. So it's not a reason for us to deny sufficiency, because a skilled person would be able to perform the treatment. They would know who was going to respond and who wasn't going to respond. So they sort of dismissed that argument out of hand. That's something in favour of a nice piece of case law. Charlotte, I think.
Yeah.
It's over to you again.
So Hazel's spoken about how dosing regimens of small molecules are treated. And so one question is are biologic dosing regimens held to the same high hurdle, and are they being applied consistently? And I think the question is, it's not yet sure. there doesn't seem to be too many Board of Appeal cases coming out about dosing regimens of antibodies and other biologic therapies. But I would say at the first instance, it appears currently that the opposition division level are possibly treating them more favourably, as particularly in the context of inventiveness. There are a number of different arguments that are being put forward by patent proprietors to support inventiveness, which of the antibody dosing regimens, which distinguish them from small molecule inventions. So, for example, there are arguments to say that the case law relating to dosing regimens are only in the context of small molecules, and so therefore not applicable. And therefore, all the body of case law, which, as Hazel has mentioned, is rather negative in the context of inventiveness, shouldn't apply to biologics. There's also arguments such as antibodies and other biologics should be treated differently from small molecules because they have potentially complex pharmacodynamics, and the half-life and elimination rate of antibodies depends on more factors such as dosage and level of expression of the target antigen. And in turn, these types of factors can vary depending on disease state. Other considerations that are being put forward by patent proprietors include the fact that antibodies, there's target-mediated clearance and anti-drug antibodies, all of which come together to make dosing regimens of antibodies far more uncertain, regardless of the prior art. So that's the kind of arguments that are being put forward in opposition proceedings, and I think they will go through to appeal proceedings in due course. But currently, the body of case law at the Board of Appeal level is limited, and will only get increasingly. It will get more and more as antibody patents are challenged, and they go through the Board of Appeal proceedings. I think also as maybe biologic therapies become more mainstream, inventive step may well become harder to prove, especially the dosing regimen, as it becomes more routine to understand what dosing is required for antibodies. I've mentioned earlier that the patent in question in Board of Appeal decision T235 of 22, which I referred to in respect of added matter, was remitted back to the opposition division to decide on other matters. So you may recall, I'll just go back to the claim. The claim was to a dosing regimen for rituximab. And it was in a, no, it wasn't, sorry. It was in the context of a particular anti-CD47 agent and its dosing. A preliminary opinion that has been issued prior to oral proceedings in that case has indicated the OD, whilst inventive step is to be discussed at oral proceedings, they currently consider the claimed use and dosage inventive. So we will wait and see whether or not that is the outcome of oral proceedings. There are a couple of cases which aren't exactly dosing regimens, but they do relate to biologics. If you could move on, Hazel. So T1927 of 22 is a pharmaceutical composition wherein it's an antibody that specifically binds PCSK9, and it's for use in reducing lipoprotein A levels in a patient with a specific level of lipoprotein, and they've been diagnosed at being at risk of developing cardiovascular disease. Inventive step novelty was decided that the claim was novel due to the specified lipoprotein level, but it was considered inventive as well because there was doubt in the art regarding a link between these inhibitors and the lipoprotein levels, and arguments were raised that due to the particular context, animal studies were difficult, and therefore an entire new clinical trial would have to be developed. And as such, there's no reasonable expectation of success. And so this patent was considered inventive. Can move on. And then this is actually a formulation rather than it's a formulation for use in therapy of pembrolizumab. So it's not a specific dosing regimen, because as I say, there's not too much case law on dosing regimens. But this was considered inventive as well. The closest prior art was discussed therapeutic uses of anti-PD-1 antibodies, including pembrolizumab, but there was no disclosure in that prior art document of stable formulations suitable for human use. In fact, that closest prior art document didn't disclose any formulations of pembrolizumab. So the Board of Appeal formulated the technical effect of this claim was that the high degree of stability that was necessary for human phase 3 trials and marketing. If you can move that on, Hazel. There's other prior art documents available, which there was a considerable disclosure of different approaches for efficient formulation of antibody pharmaceuticals. However, the Board of Appeal considered that hindsight was required to apply these teachings to pembrolizumab specifically, and to select the claimed formulation out of possible other suitable formulations was required the use of hindsight. As a result, the claims were considered inventive as well. So those are kind of two, they're not analogous to some of the case law that Hazel's mentioned earlier, but they do show that there seems to be the Board of Appeals are willing to consider biologics inventive, even when there is prior art out there which possibly could be combined to arrive at the claimed invention. So this is a patent that has not yet had a Board of Appeal decision in it. So it's under appeal under number T0563 of 24. So this claim was upheld in amended form by the opposition division. And the claims are to a combination of a IL-4 receptor antagonist, which is dupilumab, plus long-acting beta-2 agonists and inhaled corticosteroids in specific dosages. And the highlighted text was added during opposition proceedings. So there was a step of selecting a patient who has moderate to severe asthma that is uncontrolled with a background asthma therapy that comprised inhaled corticosteroids or LABA, or a combination thereof. So can you move on? So the opposition division ruled that it was inventive as amended because the claim was directed to a group of patients for whom the therapy was known to be more difficult than for a general group of asthma patients. And so they acknowledged that there was clear pointers in the prior art that that this particular combination could be used to treat asthma. However, it was inventive because it was considered that a therapeutic effect in the specific patient population was known to be difficult to achieve, and therefore it was not considered routine. So the opposition division ruled that this was inventive, and we're now awaiting the Board of Appeal review of the opposition division's findings. So drafting considerations, which is possibly where we were previously. So we all require a crystal ball to determine where we may end up with our claims, but possibly for dosing regimens, that needs to be an even greater kind of exercise at the start of the drafting process. As Hazel mentioned, claims with a narrow scope that read directly onto a label are very useful. So as we mentioned previously, possibly drafting multiple statements of invention with differing scope and different combination of features, or multiple dependencies, as Hazel mentioned. Don't just limit clinical trial dosages to examples, put them in the general description as well. As Hazel mentioned as well, possible subcategories of patient class and biomarkers may also help to overcome inventive step objections. We also mentioned that timing of filings is critical. You need data in the application as filed, or to be at least plausible from your teaching. But you also need to be aware of any disclosure of clinical trial protocols in the prior art. Hazel, I don't know if you've got anything to add to those drafting considerations.
No, only to say I found that bit of case law I was talking about before on the dependent claims. I think T1137 of 21 is what I'm talking about. And in that case, I think there were 27 claims, and they tried to combine 8 dependent claims into the main claim, and ended up with an added matter objection. So if I've got the right case, that one's worth a look. But yeah, I just agree with everything Charlotte said. If you can get your crystal balls out and predict where you're going to end up, and put that in the patent application, that's always really helpful.
So I think we can finish. We've got just sort of 5 minutes that Hazel's got a case study on a dosing regimen, which is of the moment, I would say.
Yes, so I was just going to mention something fairly topical, kind of thing that hopefully you can drop into conversation with friends and family to show how relevant and interesting the patent world is. So I don't know if anybody recognises that structure, which I'll give you a little clue. Semaglutide, and if I tell you it is a GL1P receptor agonist, I think people might be starting to sort of recognise it, better recognise it under its various trade names. So I'm just going to focus on the Wegovy aspect of it, because there's 2 quite nice dosage regime claims there. The first of which, that's what was granted in the US. So you had a once-weekly, subcutaneous once-weekly amount of at least 0.7 mg up to 1.6 cell therapy. In Europe, that ended up being granted slightly differently. They got the at least 0.7 mg per week, but then they had to stick a little bit of formulation information in there to get that through. Now that was opposed, and the opposition division held it for lack of inventive step, because there was prior art that disclosed semaglutide that could be used once a week at a dose of 0.1 to 1.6 mg, and that you'd have an expectation of weight loss. It was an interesting piece of art, because it was the closest part was a combination therapy, and semaglutide was just one GLP-1 agonist amongst several, and the board didn't buy the argument that you would have to select that one out. They just said that no, the skilled person would do that. They'd have considered that dose. So we're not saying that the dose is inventive and the formulation features weren't inventive anyway. Now, I know Novo Nordisk did try to submit evidence, well, the fact that this is a huge drug, a sort of a game changer, to try and persuade the board otherwise, but the board weren't having any of it. And they just emphasised the fact that commercial success does not retroactively establish inventive step. So the board sort of maintained the opposition division decision, and that was issued earlier this year in April 25. That other method of treatment claim that's listed in the US is still pending in Europe with a slightly higher dose, and that's actually having as you'd expect, a tough time in Europe. seemed to be 3 main objections last time I checked the register. The first one being they didn't like the form of the claims, in that you were trying to cover therapeutic and non-therapeutic uses, and clearly, we have 54, 4 and 5 for therapeutic uses, and non-therapeutic uses should be drafted as use claims, not purpose limited substance claims. I think more significantly, the board or the division doesn't like the fact it doesn't think the high doses are supported by the examples, and they have made an objection to the fact that they don't think the claims are inventive across their whole scope, because the claims don't reflect the fact that to avoid GI side effects, you should actually start with a low dose and do dose escalation rather than going straight in with the high dose. So I haven't quite followed that argument, but needless to say, it's having a tough time at the EPO. So we shall watch that one with interest and see where it ends up. And I think that's it from me. Charlotte, do you have anything else to add?
No, but if we've got sort of 5 minutes, I guess, if there's any other questions that are burning.
Sure, Charlotte and Hazel, there's a few questions I've saved for you from the audience here. The first 3 are in regard to prior art, and the last one is more general. So the first question is, if a theoretical dosage range in a prior art document is given without data, but does specifically state a theoretical dose, such as a specific minimum dose or specific maximum dose, how does that affect novelty and inventive step of a later claim, including the prior art dosage range?
So I think you'd be okay for novelty. I think you've got a problem with inventive step. I think the board has sort of established that you've got to have demonstrated the efficacy for a novelty attack to succeed. That being said, if the board takes a position that dosage regimes, it's routine work and you've got this document telling you what to try, I think that's probably where they would focus their objections. Charlotte, do you disagree or agree?
I think so. I have certainly overcome that kind of disclosure in prosecution proceedings. I think it would come down to the facts of what else is around the prior art as well. So is it credible or plausible? So this language of plausible has been used at the EPO in recent years. Does the prior art make that dosage plausible? And what does the patent application as filed add over and above that disclosure? So if actually the kind of that dosing is in the kind of context of in the prior art of nothing else enabling it or making it plausible, then I think you've got a better chance to say we were the first to make it plausible. However, often you will get, well, it was a reasonable expectation of success. And actually there is case law now which says if it was obvious to try, even if you get some kind of bonus effect, it doesn't matter. You're still lacking inventive step because it was obvious to try that. So it would depend on how plausible did that prior art make trying that particular dosage, I think.
I think it also comes back to the case law we talked about, where it was a really poor prognosis for a particular patient group. And even though, so in that case, there wasn't a reasonable expectation that it would work because there'd been so much failure beforehand. So if you're in a situation like that, that sort of, you've had lots of failed trials, that sort of thing, I think can help just move the divisions and the boards away from this. If you're doing a trial, there is an expectation that it will work.
Here's another question about specific prior art data. Have there been cases in which PK/PD or ADME data from preclinical studies are used to reject dosing regimen claims in human patients for lack of inventive step?
Preclinical. I think it would always potentially be raised in opposition proceedings. I think possibly there would be arguments against it. But I can't think off the top of my head any particular case law that provides that. But I have no doubt that in some instances, that kind of data could be used against a dosing regimen. Hazel, I don't know if you've had that.
I've seen it used, in support of sufficiency. I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but if we do, I'm sure we can feed that back in.
Fair enough. Here's another slightly more general question. Pharma companies routinely generate internal correspondence on the probability of success for their candidates as they move through the development process toward regulatory approval. Would that type of internal correspondence be discoverable and possibly used to invalidate a patent later? And then the question ends with the statement, it would be unreasonable to ask a company not to generate such assessments.
We don't have a form of discovery at the European Patent Office, and certainly in front of the UPC. I don't believe that kind of correspondence would be discoverable.
It'd be very
Certainly
difficult
not at the European Patent Office.
Yeah, I think it'd be very difficult to argue that it would fall within the definition of prior art if it's
Sure.
If it's confidential correspondence.
Okay.
I think one thing to say there is probably the people that are generating those documents may well not be considered the definition of a skilled person, so they would probably be more inventors and a higher. So this concept of a skilled person has little imagination or invention, and so it might be that it isn't the right level of person that's generating that type of work as well.
All right, one last question. Given the EPO's specific approach to dosage regimens, what practical challenges do you encounter when coordinating prosecution strategies across jurisdictions, like internationally, with different approaches to medical use claims?
Well, added matter is something that is always an issue, or usually an issue in Europe that you don't necessarily have to deal with in the US. I'm trying to think of any other issues.
Do other jurisdictions allow the same sorts of dosing regimen claims that the EPO allows? Is that an option for folks outside the EPO?
My understanding is that there are several jurisdictions that allow that kind of second medical use dosing regimen type claim.
I would say it's mixed. I would say even within the European Union, although we have them at the EPO, I think there are certain EU states that don't look at them particularly favourably. I don't think the French have sort of been French courts have looked at them too favourably. I think they've only recently sort of started allowing them. So I think it is mixed.
Yeah, I think the UK Patents Court also does not particularly like dosing regimens, and there's quite negative case law out in the UK on them.
Interesting. All right. Well, Charlotte and Hazel, thank you very much for the excellent presentation, and thank you for being our guest speakers today. You both did a terrific job. Kind audience, if you have any additional questions, please feel free to email them to me or the presenters, and we will get back to you. A link to the slides for today's presentation will be emailed to you in case you're still looking for those. I hope you will tune in to additional episodes of the SLW Chemistry and Biology Seminar Series. Thank you very much for tuning in and for your attention today.
Thank you.